Thank you very much, Roshan, and thank you very much for the invitation. In some ways this project is something of a continuation of a number of years of work, but what I'll be talking about really is the recent collaboration which we call SAFI, Studying African Farmer-led Irrigation. And because I will necessarily need to fill in some background on this. So the basic reason for the project was, if I could just sort of look back over a few decades now, irrigation in Africa has been regarded as quite problematic. It was dominated in the colonial period by engineering designs, generally large-scale state infrastructure, that is, say, colonial state infrastructure, with small-scale farmers operating as tenants of the scheme. But in the process, pre-colonial systems were largely ignored. In other words, there was a general consensus that irrigation didn't exist in Africa. It wasn't part of traditional African agriculture. Therefore, much of the perception of irrigation was really governed by colonial engineering perceptions, and therefore regarded as imported into the system. By the 1970s and 1980s, although there'd been a big push to invest in irrigation in Africa, it was largely regarded as a failure. A number of critiques have been published around the early 1990s, focusing on inappropriate technical design, high cost, low performance, and basically this led to a hiatus in irrigation development in sub-Saharan Africa during the decade of the 1990s through to the early years of the first decade of this century. And partly as a result of that, although African agriculture was regarded as stagnating and low productivity, it was also the sort of prevailing discourse at the start of this century was that Africa had little irrigation, certainly relative to Asia, but was very, very low in terms of the potential for irrigation development. So there was a sense that African agriculture didn't have irrigation, it was underutilized, and there was a sort of a concern to try and develop irrigation. And certainly when NEPAD was formed, that's the New Economic Partnership for African Development, they developed something called the Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Program, in which Pillar 1, one of the first of 4 pillars, called for reliable water control systems. So it was immediately seen as in a sense, a missing element of the need to develop Africa's agricultural potential. And this was given renewed impetus by the food commodity crisis in 2007-2008, and this led to an increase in efforts to try and get foreign investment in large-scale agriculture, much of which is predicated on irrigation. However, in practice, this has been relatively slow, with the exception of sugarcane, which has developed, but was largely taking over existing large-scale irrigation schemes. So, although formal irrigation has been slow to develop, in fact, over the last decade or so, there's been accumulating evidence that actually small-scale irrigators have been investing in their own irrigation, largely outside any planned government intervention. This you can see in the Ag Water project, which is funded by the Gates Foundation. A number of bits of evidence emerged. One which was unexpected was a huge number of pumps being imported into Ghana, water pumps, and bought by farmers. Later on, the International Water Management Institute, developing remote sensing studies, was picking up that actually irrigation extent as picked up by remote sensing was much greater than had previously been thought, and certainly much greater than official statistics suggested, all of which fed into the idea that actually irrigation was being developed outside any official planned process. And it was at that point that we brought in the SAFI project to try and explore in more detail what was going on with these, what I suppose you could call informal irrigation schemes. And the project was funded by UK DFID and ESRC through the Growth Research Programme. It was a partnership between African researchers at the Nelson Mandela African Institute for Science and Technology in Arusha in Tanzania, and the ISPM, Instituto Superior Politécnico de Manica in Mozambique, and also with partners in Wageningen University in the Netherlands, and ultimately in Sheffield and in Montpellier, France, and Edinburgh. So what we tried to do, we tried to undertake case studies of small-scale farmers, trying to get a sense of what social and economic changes and whether these were differentiated. But also we were interested to engage with governments and other development agencies to see what kind of response they had, because this is a phenomenon. It's not something which anybody ordained, it is happening. And so therefore the interest was to see, well, what is the policy actually? And we were working on this in Tanzania and Mozambique, but more broadly, we tried to engage across sub-Saharan Africa. And then finally, we tried to undertake a pilot study to get some sense of whether remote sensing imaging could generate more accurate estimates of the irrigated areas. So these are the sites we looked at in Tanzania and Mozambique. Tanzania in the northeast, around Moshi, Pangani Basin, but also Great Ruaha in the Rufiji, and then down on Lake Rukwa. In Mozambique, mostly around the central area, Sofala, Manica, but also a couple of sites up in Nampula. So in all, there were 9 sites in each country, so making 18 sites in all. A variety of technologies. These relate to the kind of things that one comes across in central Mozambique. These are mainly what are called hill furrow systems, stream diversions. So streams diverted using fairly makeshift kinds of weirs, diverted across the landscape, often going over several kilometers, following contours. This is a pipe taking water across a gully, water taken into fields, water running across improvised dikes and so forth. Another sort of approach would be down in wetlands, where you use, again, makeshift structures to try and regulate the level of water in fields. This is growing paddy rice here. The big game changer, as I mentioned before, is the importation of small pumps, mobile pumps that you can use to move water around the landscape. There's fields of beans, cabbages, and so forth, local traders coming to pick it up and take it to market. So what we found principally was this is market driven. This is driven by urbanization. These are people producing high value vegetables and fruit principally, but also quite a lot of the irrigation is going on for paddy rice. We were concerned that this was something that was being done by people from outside local communities, and certainly there's a lot of population movement involved in this process, but we did find that 80% of irrigators get half or more of their total income from their irrigated crop production. So this is making significant impact on people's livelihoods. We did find that irrigators were farming more land, they use more inputs, they hire labor, they are moving into more what one might call commercial farming. There are big increases in crop sales relative to people who are not irrigating, sometimes tenfold in Mozambique or fivefold in Tanzania. And clearly this raises questions about social inequalities opening up. And we're carrying on working on the database on this. I just want to say something about policymakers' response, which at an international level, this has been picked up very enthusiastically. The World Bank has now its own program on farmer-led irrigation with a package, a technical package based on solar-powered groundwater pumping. So this is now being pushed not just in terms of sub-Saharan Africa, but actually at a global level. The International Water Management Institute also involved in that. The African Union has also shown interest in this. So at an international level, where there's been a long-standing, in a sense, concern about the lack of irrigation in Africa, this is being picked up quite enthusiastically. At a national level, we found in meetings we've had that there are some national governments that are actually quite positive. So in Ghana, for example, you find policymakers talking about seeking out and removing binding constraints confronting small-scale irrigators. In places that we've worked, particularly in Tanzania and Mozambique, we find rather more cautious approaches with emphasis on regulating what small-scale irrigators are doing. In other words, a sense that this may not necessarily be a totally good thing. And I think this kind of question comes out when we start looking at the remote sensing pilot study that we did, which we did find brought new insights into how much irrigation was going on. We were able to identify quite large areas, very much larger areas than is perceived in official statistics. It's not ideal. It doesn't pick up all the areas. There are problems with some of the irrigation that involves agroforestry systems, for example, but it does bring new insights. So to that extent, it can make these large and very widespread areas of new irrigation, informal irrigation, it makes them more visible. But there is no regulatory framework to deal with this, because most governments don't have systems for dealing with the rights of water abstraction by large numbers of small-scale irrigators. And there's a real issue of capacity at local level as to how one registers, how one gets people to pay water fees, how this should indeed be regulated. And I think the other issue which builds into the politics of all of this is that water policy is dominated by what I call a conservationist approach, in which water scarcity is the organizing principle, and therefore the presumption is that water is in short supply. And small-scale irrigators are moving into an arena which is dominated by already powerful players, particularly hydropower, large urban centers, but also, certainly in East Africa, wildlife tourism is a very important claim on water resources. So although this is a widespread and very dynamic process, the governance of this and the way that official agencies are going to deal with it is by no means clear at present. So this is just some things that we've brought to, which we've put out from the project. There's a policy brief which emerged from a consultation we had in the Bellagio Center. And also emerging from that was a special issue of Water Alternatives, which started looking at some case studies and how this process is evolving. The African Union's framework for irrigation development and agricultural water management is published in 2020 and incorporates farmer-led irrigation now as one of its pathways of development. And we have an online training course which we developed with our partners in Arusha in Tanzania, and this is now available online as an introduction to this. That's where we've got to so far. So thank you.